It's been about a year since I started regularly posting on this channel. And in a sense, it's really been a year since I started reading fiction again, because for many, many years I was only reading nonfiction. And it is really nice to go back to fiction for a while and to remember what it is about great literary writing that elevates it beyond just merely details and facts and places it into a space of play. And I want to talk about my year in reading, but I don't want to give a best of list because I do think the books that I was reading feel so different from each other. I don't know how to stack them in a hierarchical order without feeling fairly arbitrary or dishonest. Thankfully, The Active Mind recently released a end of year book tag in which he answers various questions about the different books that he read throughout the year. And so I'm going to try to do something just like that and use these questions as excuses to just talk about the books that I want to talk about. And there's a wide range of books. It's actually in the process of thinking about what books I want to mention for this. I started to realize I really read quite a lot more than I thought this year. So there's quite a lot to talk about, and I hope that I help you discover some books for yourself. I think so much of why I want to do this channel is to help people discover great books. So I hope that this helps you discover some books. The first question on this list is a book that surprised you, but I'm going to put it as books that surprised you because I think there was a few. The first book that surprised me is a classic work that I finally read for the first time, and that is The Decameron by Boccaccio. The Decameron captures a series of stories being delivered by young people hanging out in the midst of the Black Death of 1348. The idea is they're trying to pass the time and also distract themselves from the horrors that abound around them. And their way of doing so is to tell these lighthearted, entertaining stories, and often quite lascivious stories of sexual escapades and theft and lying, the exact kinds of things that you would want from distracting stories. And it's back to back, just story after story of not high art style storytelling, merely just the fun of consequences building one atop the other. The way that the book is organized is day by day as these young people gather together and tell these stories. And they follow a theme within each day. So you already know where the stories are going to end up. But what I found so striking and surprising about actually getting through the Decameron is how enjoyable the book still is. Even though it was written hundreds of years ago, it feels so completely contemporary in terms of the humor and the over-the-top ridiculousness of it. It's almost cartoon-like with its absurdity sometimes. The way that it plays with temptation and foolishness and mockery, how often it seems to mock the priesthood of its day or certain norms that surround it. And you could feel an energy behind it, like an enthusiasm from the writer to just have fun with stories. And I know a lot of the stories in the Decameron are not entirely of the author's invention, but what he invents within them is this connection to the Europe of his day, or of Florence in his day. And it's that commitment on his part to wanting to have fun with stories. And it just it puts me back in that place of remembering how fun stories can be. And I actually jumped around between two translations when I was reading the Decameron. I was reading the Penguin Classics translation, which is by G.H. McWilliam. But then I also jumped around to the Richard Aldington translation because I had this really old copy, which I'm pretty sure is my dad's old copy. I found the Richard Aldington it felt more sophisticated in terms of the sentence structure and far less committed to needing to explain everything. But then I just kept jumping back to the Penguin one because it did add a lot of really helpful footnotes. So I don't really have a perfect translation. Neither one felt ideal for reading the Decameron, but it was nice just kind of jumping back and forth. But the main takeaway from the Decameron was just, it's a classic work that feels completely enjoyable for modern day in that it just gives in fully to its own humor and courage to criticize the time and space in which it's in. And another book that surprised me this year was Keats' Poetry and Prose, specifically the Norton Critical Edition. And I say that edition in particular because it organizes the text with his poems in the time that they were written, followed by the letters that he was writing around the same time. And in those letters, you get bits of his life story, and then back to the poetry, back to his letters, back to the poetry. And it's this moving back and forth between his actual life and what he was communicating to those that he knew at the time, with the personal expression and artistry in his poetry that made it feel as if you were getting his mind based on what was troubling him, what he couldn't help but think about and want to talk about with those who were nearest to him. I found that this felt so much like a really great biographical way into someone like Keats. And his poetry is so beautiful, but it's also interesting just the conditions in which he was in, and also what happened to him with his health and his eventual death far too soon. It just made this book feel so full in your impression of this individual and poetic history. I think it's a fantastic way to be introduced to Keats, not just to read his poetry, but also to kind of get a sense of him along the way. And then another surprising book was Morning Abreast by Shi, which is a book I got free from the NYRB Classics publisher. This book surprised me because it is about an author who is diagnosed with breast cancer and must get a mastectomy. That subject matter seems so heavy and difficult to write about, and you would imagine that the obvious route through that is to zero in on the pain and to talk about means of coping. But what this book ends up doing is performing means of coping through humor and play and curiosity, the ways that when one becomes sick, when one's body begins to betray them, it can feel like a means of control to start to fixate quite a lot and to obsess over understanding. And it's that distance from understanding that makes it so frustrating sometimes. You can't find your own way back to a kind of equilibrium. I found it so satisfying the way that this author chose to be experimental and playful and strange with her description of her experiences through this mastectomy. And also to capture the strangeness of people around her, the ways that doctors start to dissect you or view you as a model of something as opposed to an individual, and just that distancing that starts to happen. There's so much solid human pain in this without being presented in a painful way. I just love this example of how to talk about something difficult without yourself wallowing in the despair that's always on the cusp of a trying and potentially traumatic experience. If you're curious to read an unusual take on a cancer diagnosis and how that has such a profound effect on one's life, then check out Morning Abreast by Shi. Another end of the year question is, what is the longest book you read this year? Now, there are books I read that are longer in terms of page counts, but in terms of how long it actually took me to read it and the length that it felt, I would have to say the Oxford Handbook of Reasons and Normativity. And this one took me a really long time because it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a compilation of essays by analytic philosophers on the questions of the ways that reasons weigh in on our actions and our choices. And the normativity part of it is what compelled me to want to read the book, because it's trying to deal with the problem of how can reasons apply objectively as a reason for you individually. Like, why is it that you should care about the reasons that are on offer to you? And that might seem like super basic and simple, but of course it's that kind of a question that is at the essence of any kind of ethical claim, like any claim of your duty or your obligation to others, and or the standards of virtue that you should live up to, and or the consequences that you should care about or consider. All of those imply an adherence or caring about reasons, about you actually valuing reasons. But of course, if they have any power or authority, it does require the person caring about the reasons being offered. And so this book goes through all kinds of ways that question of what makes a reason valuable, or actually that's only one small part of it. It's not just what makes reasons valuable, but what makes reasons compelling or relevant. When you really dig down deep into it, it becomes more and more and more complicated as it goes. I wanted to get through this book because I thought it would help me with a certain kind of conundrum that I feel in my head, which I'll have to talk about at some point down the line. What it ended up doing instead is it gave me a sense of all the ways in which we can categorize up our language in order to communicate better about a subject without actually moving forward in the subject in a way that is substantial. And that sounds like a criticism of the book, but I actually did enjoy getting those options of how to articulate the weight of reasons, and also how to consider what I take for granted in regards to what matters. But I still don't think I've reached the end point of what I'm seeking in terms of this topic. This book was tough. I think the kind of language that it uses, it's almost the stereotype of what analytic philosophy reads like. So I'll give you like a sentence. It is a necessary condition for any consideration counting as a reason to perform an act that the agent in question be able to perform the act, although it is not the primary goal of the chapter to contend that a similar claim holds of reasons for belief. We can end by suggesting that it may in fact be of the essence of normative judgments, as compared to merely evaluative judgments, that they are appropriate only when agents can perform the acts in question. So you see how that's the kind of sentences that you're getting. So it took me a really long time to get through this, but I'm trying to get through a whole bunch of Oxford handbooks because I do want to at some point give a full video on my Oxford handbook collection, because I do think they're immensely valuable for those especially interested in science and philosophy. But it's going to take a while because these books are hefty and they're tough, and to summarize them is really difficult, especially if you pay close attention to all the details in each of the segments. But this is definitely the longest book that I read this year, is Reasons and Normativity, the Oxford Handbook. So now we have the question of a new favorite author from this year. And I think I'll have to split it between two authors. And I actually talk about both of them in my maniacal must-reads video. But the first of the two would have to be Donald Barthelme with his Library of America collected stories. This contains all of the stories that he wrote throughout his career, as far as I know. What was so remarkable about Barthelme, and I don't want to go on too long because I already talked about it in the maniacal must-reads video, but what's so remarkable about him is that in a short story format, he manages to capture the maximalist feel that I would otherwise get from a massive tome of postmodern literature. And that's the last thing I expected from an author like him. I had heard about Barthelme a lot, but I did not know that he nailed so completely the feeling that I wanted from a good postmodern text. And it's that feeling of complete and utter analytical rigorousness and obsessiveness, but also that feeling of distress in communication, that desire to communicate rigorously for the sake of something, of having something really deep down to get out, and capturing the frustration of communication within those stories. And he plays around a lot with the ideas of existentialism and the absurd and just this feeling of disconnection. And he's very funny and humorous, but he's also constantly battling with you, the reader. There's like a struggle, an interplay back and forth between the reader and the writer in these stories. What I really was impressed by going through this collection is I felt like he did not get better as a writer. He just stayed great the whole time. From the very first collection on, I really just adored his voice, and I felt like he was using it effectively the whole way through. I'm so shocked that I hadn't read this author before and that I would love him this much. I really, really enjoy Donald Barthelme. So I'm glad that one of you sent me this book and that I actually got through it, and it really was worth it. It was absolutely worth having, and I highly recommend checking out Donald Barthelme's collected stories if you get a chance. Similarly, I got into the author Julio Cortázar, and I was just piling my way through a whole bunch of his books. So I have some of them here. We have all of these books right here, and I'll put the names of the books in the description so I don't have to just list them all out. But a lot of these are short story collections, and that was my initial foray into Julio Cortázar, is just his short stories. And I thought he's so feverish in his writing style. It just feels like someone who has something to get out in almost a rush, and it's dreamlike in so much of his writing, but it also still has that cleverness of experimentation in the structure of the text. But it was really getting outside of his short stories and getting into some of his longer works where he really commits hard to that. I don't want to call it stream of consciousness all the time, because it's almost dream logic mixed with being overwhelmed by desire. And it's that emotional side of Julio Cortázar that I just love so much. And it feels different than some of the other works that might seem structurally similar in terms of his experimentation. He felt like someone who was always thinking about the feel, the feel, the feel, the feel. And that feverishness that I mentioned is an almost rage to get out some kind of feeling in the writing. And I can't express enough how happy I am to finally be reading Julio Cortázar. I did not know, same with Donald Barthelme, I did not realize what I was missing. When people bring up these two authors, it's sort of like, okay, yeah, I'll get around to it. But I really, really love their style of writing. So those are two authors that stood out to me this year, Donald Barthelme and Julio Cortázar. And again, like I mentioned, I talk about both of them quite a bit in my maniacal must-reads video. And then we have a question of an author who didn't work out for you this year. I think I enjoyed pretty much everything that I read this year, but I guess the author who didn't quite persuade me as much as I wanted her to would have to be J.T. Ismail with her book, How Physics Makes Us Free. I had heard about this author because she's done a lot of interviews and podcasts, and I really think she's incredible. Her capacity to communicate very complicated philosophy in a cogent way. And this book didn't contradict that at all. She's an incredible communicator. But her end goal with this was to persuade the reader that free will is perfectly compatible with our grasping of physics. What she ended up doing far better than that was really offer up a whole range of really great ways of thinking about closed and open systems, and also some of the recent graspings of how to communicate cause and effect, or the notion of the ways that things relate to each other. And in that sense, the book was phenomenal. But then in the very second half, when she's really piling it all together to reach this broader conclusion about why it is that you can hear all of the arguments against free will and still find them inadequate. That was supposed to be her claim, like the inadequacy of the arguments against free will. I don't feel like she nailed it. She ended up very softly landing her way out of the problem by kind of flippantly mentioning, oh, well, this kind of free will is obviously impossible, so let's move on to this other kind. But it's like that first one was the one that I thought she was really going to contend with, and she kind of just pushes it away at the end. I would still recommend this book a lot. I think it's probably the best argument in favor of free will that I've seen, especially with her use of physics in order to make that point. But it doesn't completely satisfy, because it tries really hard to move the goalpost at the very, very end, and that's when you want it to matter the most. And it's a little annoying that happens, because otherwise it's such an incredible book on the subject. That was a bit of a shame. And then we have the question of the saddest book that you read this year. The book that comes to my mind is actually one that I talked about in my Beauty and Books video, and that's going to be The Butterfly Stories by William T. Vollmann. And that book is about a man addicted to prostitution, and it honestly portrays the sickness of that, the sickness in all directions, and the accumulation of addiction, and the ways that addiction feeds and justifies itself. The book is just so sad because it doesn't offer any way out. By the end, it just feels like a story about someone who is condemned to be miserable. And it's not as simple as just granting them advice for how to get out, because the very motivation that they have, and this is why I wanted to read something like Reasons and Normativity, right? Because it's really about, well, how do you motivate someone to get out of a bind that their own thinking has put them into? Because if their thought process is winding in that way, then it's that same thought process that is going to be interpreting the words that you say or the reasons that you give. So how do you untether that link? Is there a way out? Butterfly Stories capture so nicely that kind of viciousness of cycling, winding thoughts when there isn't an easy way out for someone. Or at least there isn't an easy way out of the desire, and that's the problem. You can make obvious all the consequences of their actions, but people want what they want, and you'd have to change so much of the person to change what they want. It's not a book that you should read first from William T. Vollmann, because it is very just raw and painful and not fun, but it is sad, and if you want to be sad, then it's a great book for that. Another book that felt in contention with this one as the saddest book of the year would have to be The Guilt Project by Vanessa Place, which, as you can see in the subtitle, is a pretty heavy book. Vanessa Place works as a lawyer for indigent offenders. They have already been charged for the crime and they already went through trial, and now they're appealing the trial. So her position as a lawyer is to defend people against abuses of the system. But the thing that makes the book so compelling, but also so difficult to get through, is that the exact sort of people she has to defend against the abuses of the system are themselves abusers. She's really trying to make a defense of the value of being consistent within the legal system and allowing the presumption of innocence to hold even for the absolute worst among us. And it's an incredibly sad book because she is not shy at all about how horrible these people are. And she's also not shy at all about her conviction that she still has to do her job and how we need people like her to do that kind of job. It's exactly the kind of book that I think is most prone to offending those who just even hear about the notion of defending the worst among us. In that sense, that's another sad element of it, because it's one of those things that is a reality of a legal system, of having any kind of society, is you're going to have certain kind of rules, and those rules might be in favor of the people we don't want it to be in favor of. But then the rule itself might still be valid. But it's a contentious issue, and the book itself is tough to get through for that reason. So those are the two saddest books, and I actually don't recommend you read either of them. I think the only sort of person who should read either of those books is the kind of person who gets excited by being told you shouldn't read them. Don't read either of those books. The next category is nonfiction that reads most like fiction. I didn't realize until I was gathering these books that I actually read a whole bunch of books by one author, and I didn't intend to do that. It just kind of snowballed naturally in that direction. And that is the works of Simon Sebag Montefiore. We have the Romanovs, we have The World, we have Young Stalin, and we have Stalin, the Court of the Red Tsar. I started with his book, The World. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a history of the world. And what ended up so impressive about that book is how Simon Sebag Montefiore goes into such intense detail, factual, objective detail, while also using the tools of a fiction writer to build relationships among those details. And that book, The World, which here I'll hold up, so you can see it's quite a thick book. It's such a crazy history book because it feels like all the talents of literature, all the effect of literature with the intensity of factual detail of a nonfiction work. The organization of it was just so impressive to me that I then kept jumping around to his other work. So I read The Romanovs, which is a history of the Romanov dynasty in Russia. And again, he structures it so well in a literary sense of like the very opening of the book deals with the sufferings of a young heir to the throne. And then the end of the book also deals with the sufferings of a young heir to the throne. And if you know Russian history, you know exactly who I would be referring to. It's this feeling of momentum that he creates between these historical figures and these historical moments of time. And it's just fascinating to me as a skill, as a writer, his ability to kind of create that momentum so nicely, even though it is supposed to be a history book. The only time when he really falters in that flow is in his book, Young Stalin. I didn't like that one that much because it felt too exciting or swashbuckling. It felt like an old adventure story being wrapped around Stalin's life. And there's obvious gaps that he has to fill in, and I think it was just too obvious what he was filling in. Stalin, Court of the Red Tsar, I think was much more successful in terms of giving us a storytelling form of this historical character, Stalin, and then making us feel the tension of what it would be like to be around this kind of person and the risks involved with his rise to power and also abuse of it. Simon Sebag Montefiore is one of those writers who I think I really like him just because I'm so impressed by what he's doing. I don't think these are the best history books that I've read. Although actually The World is, I don't know, The World is a really crazy history book. So maybe that one probably will last for a while as one of the great history books I've read. But just in general, I just think he's just an enjoyable writer. I think he's a very nice, smooth writer. He's very detailed. It's almost like he's self-conscious about his literary capacity because he's always also trying to prove that he did the research and the work. So it's like he's like always balancing out the literary elements with like, look at how much detail I can throw in. And he definitely overdoes the detail a lot. But if you treat it like a maximalist novel, like the world feels like reading Infinite Jest or something. It just feels so intensely detailed. If you read it like that, there's a lot of fun to be had. Those are some of the books that are nonfiction that reads like fiction, in the sense of having some of that artistry contained within it, even though it's not blatant or obvious on the surface. And then we have a category I just made up for this video, and that is books that are personally gratifying. I really just wanted to throw in these 5 books. So we have Blue Remembered Star by Bren Booth Jones, Open Letters to the Sky by the same author, Vertigo to Go by Bren Booth Jones. Then we have Cactus by Philip Hall, and we have Fume by Philip Hall. Both of these authors are booktubers, and I only know of them from BookTube. And I had the good fortune of being invited to do a book launch for Bren Booth Jones for his poetry. So he sent me his 3 books, and I got to read them and really read them carefully for this launch. And I say it's personally gratifying because it felt so nice to read poetry carefully again. It's been a long time. You know, that's something that I had to do for school, obviously. It's just nice to read carefully, but also read with a specific person in mind, and to think about talking to that person and becoming friends with that person, getting to know them and knowing about the changes in his life. And it was just so nice to see his craft being employed well, and to be impressed by someone that you know. That was just really satisfying. And then similarly, I find myself impressed by Philip Hall. Philip Hall is a booktuber. He knows his poetry well, and he has such enthusiasm for poetry. He sent me these 2 as a gift. In reading his 2 poetry books, his willingness to commit to the ends of confessional poetry, of that idea of the poetry is going to be that space where you put your full self into it, and you talk about some of the worst of yourself and where your thoughts lead you toward. And it is his full commitment to that worst of himself that is hugely impressive to me. And I find myself reading Philip Hall's poetry a lot slower than other poetry because he writes such long sentences. They're very like stretched and elongated, and I really want to follow the subject-verb relation throughout the whole thing. So I'm sort of reading very, very carefully through his poetry, but again, it's just that feeling of him really trying to get something out, and I appreciate that a lot. So I found all of this poetry as such a nice way back into poetry for me to remember what it is about poetry that I find so special, but then also such a nice way into relating to people who themselves are far away. That's the fun thing. That's the nice thing about BookTube. That's the nice thing about this year of doing BookTube, is you are connecting to people very far away, and you're really connecting to them in a way that feels intimate. And that is special. So I want to mention these books in this list of my 2024 books as the ones that are the most personally gratifying. And then we have the most frustrating book that you read this year. And I actually don't have a physical copy of it anymore. I sold it. And that is Duck's Newburyport by Lucy Ellman. When it comes to a book being frustrating, I actually don't think that that's a huge problem. I think it's okay for a book to be frustrating, because I do think frustration is one of the emotions that a book can make you feel. And there might be something to that, to allowing yourself to be frustrated with something and to compel yourself to actually work through it. Duck's Newburyport was a book that I had to work through. It did not work for me for a while until I really kept adapting around it. I like that a book put me in that position again, of feeling like I needed to stretch myself more. The thing that's so difficult about Duck's Newburyport is that it's presented like a single long cascading series of thoughts with comma, comma, comma breaking up each clause. And it begins with the fact that, the fact that, the fact that, and it's all about these ideas that are popping in to the narrator's head. And it's capturing that feeling of constant distraction and constant thinking and thinking and thinking and thinking, the rolling curvature of our thinking day to day to day. The main character is a mother who's just trying to keep up with her life as a mother of a family, of having kids and a husband and the troubles of living up to being in a certain space in the family. And then also other troubles with health and things of that sort. But the thing that is frustrating about Ducks Newburyport is because of how it's written, because of that kind of rolling forward of thoughts, it ends up feeling like it's never going anywhere, even though, of course, it's actually going quite far. There's so much about her thoughts that are the point of the story. And so I originally read the book physically, but I didn't like actually having to hold the book. I thought it was just too fat. And you would think, well, why would I care about the size of books? I read plenty of fat books, but it bothered me more because of the style of the writing. It felt like the actual division of the pages was distracting me from what should otherwise feel like something just going and going and going and going. And then I switched to an ebook to read it. And that's how I read like the whole middle half of the book was in an ebook. But even then, I found myself getting distracted and losing the thread, whatever thread I could find, in how it was being written. And I wasn't connecting right to what was in the book. And I knew that I wanted to finish the book. And so for the first time ever, I started listening to it as an audiobook. I gotta say, the reader of the audiobook, who I'll put her name up, the reader of that audiobook was incredible at still keeping the repetitive pace of Ducks Newburyport, like the active repetitiveness of it, but inflecting just enough to make us not be so distracted by the continuous opening of the fact that begins each clause, and making it roll in the way that holds the whole way through. I actually recommend, of the 3 different ways to read Ducks Newburyport, reading as a physical book, an ebook, or an audiobook, I think the audiobook was really the thing that helped me finish it, because I probably would have kept getting too committed to other things to want to finish that book. So it was nice to do that. Let me know what other audiobooks are worth listening to. I really felt like by the time I finally transitioned to listening to it, that was the ideal way to get through that very, very, very strange, frustrating book, while still feeling like I wasn't missing anything. So let me know what other audiobooks are worth checking out. And then we have a category of a book that lived up to the hype. It would have to be The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William L. Shirer. And you must have heard of this book. This is a pivotal history of World War II, specifically Nazi Germany. And specifically, it's a history of the rise and fall of Nazi Germany from the perspective of a journalist who was in Germany as the Nazis were coming to power, and then his frustrations at the various geopolitical mistakes that were made along the way. And it's that aspect of the book, the ways that William L. Shirer very obviously wants to focus on the parts of the history that are going to encapsulate some of what frustrated him at the time, the ways that all of these different countries were being taken by Nazi Germany without any pushback, any real pushback. And he presents that so nicely, and he uses such strong language to describe what was happening as Nazi Germany was growing in power and moving its way westward and east. And then he doesn't turn it into a narrative. What instead feels like is, it does actually feel like a journalist's summation of each of these different events in time. And he's always trying to be helpful to your understanding of how this could happen. Rise of someone so obnoxiously stupid and so obvious in his insecurity. What was intriguing to me was that William L. Shirer, even though he's obviously frustrated by the rise of Hitler and by the lack of intervention against Nazi Germany until it was almost too late, he also saves those moments of direct frustration for little pockets throughout the book. So I thought that the book would have him just constantly be communicating just how annoyed he is by things. But what he actually does for a while is he carries a tone of objectivity while selecting the facts that should make you feel like, oh my gosh, why is this happening this way? Then when it feels most agreeable to the reader, he will then slip in that moment of, and by the way, isn't this crazy? Right? These little lines, he doesn't literally say, by the way, this is crazy, but he kind of, it has that feel to it of like, look at this. This happened. And you are a citizen who could be just as prone to this kind of failure. This feeling of someone genuinely pissed off at the history that he's writing about, but maintaining self-control to not come across as enraged, but but you can feel the tension. I definitely thought that this lived up to the hype, the rise and fall of the Third Reich. So I want to mention that for this year. The next question is a scene that stuck with you, and I immediately knew exactly the scene I wanted to talk about because I just finished reading it. But I just yesterday finished reading Baron Weckham's Homecoming by Laszlo Krasznahorkai. I'm reading this because I convinced the active mind to read some of Laszlo Krasznahorkai's earlier work. I suggested that he check out Satan Tango and War and War and The Melancholy of Resistance, and he took me up on that, and he is reading them, and he's probably going to have a really fantastic video coming out soon, and I will link to that video if it's out, when this video is out. But he also was planning to read this one, so I thought, well, I should read it too, and then I could talk to him about it. There's a scene at the end, and I'm not going to give it away, I'm not going to spoil the book, but there is this effect that Krasznahorkai is trying to accomplish in the second half of the book, and it is encapsulating confusion and frustration over the senselessness of living in a society or in a world. He does this by stacking scenes back to back of untenable connections between things, and then the psychological resistance to that emerges. It's something that he does in all of his books. You know, in War and War, we have the frustration with society's inclination toward self-destruction, and then we have in Satan Tango the taking advantage of people's simplicity in some ways, and then we have in The Melancholy of Resistance the impetus toward upending things. This book feels like it is his final statement on that kind of process of overturning, and I'm actually trying not to say too much. I do want to let the active mind talk about the books in the way that he wants to, and then maybe I'll do a video in response to his later on. But I really do think that Krasznahorkai, when he pulls it off, manages to make frustration feel apocalyptic and harrowing in how overwhelming it can be. I think that's what comes to my mind. And again, I don't want to spoil, but it's basically like the whole last portion of Baron Weckham's Homecoming that feels like, okay, that is like an ongoing scene. It's like a cascade of scenes that feels like one large scene communicating that feeling of being lost in a societal space. So that's definitely what stood out to me for this year in terms of a scene from a book. And then we have a book that I thought I would love but didn't, and I still really like this book. This is the first book that I talked about in my maniacal must-reads video, and that is The Maniac by Benjamin Labatut. And I want to emphasize, I did really like this book. It basically goes through the life of Jean von Neumann, the founding game theorist. It uses his life to kind of parallel some of the desire to construct and control nature through science. It builds to this final ending segment all about AI and AlphaGo. It's that feeling of this perpetual progress in science and also perpetual myopia. Structurally, the book is phenomenal. There's definitely moments in the book that feel really strong. The thing that stopped me from loving it is, I think, in terms of style, the use of language wasn't enough for me. I didn't feel the distinctiveness between the voices enough. I didn't feel the power of perspective enough. Even though he's jumping around between different perspectives, all observing Jean von Neumann, it didn't feel like he was granting the full encompassing of what it's like to be someone else observing. It felt more like those observers were being utilized towards a more straightforward end of just essentially summarizing someone's life. It almost felt like nonfiction in that way. Like it was just trying to give us details about someone's life. It's still a really good book. I definitely don't want to tell you not to enjoy the book. I just wish that the language had more heft to it, and it didn't quite pull that off. And then we have the book with the most unique concept that I read this year. And that one, this is another one from the Maniacal Must-Reads. And that one would have to obviously be The Passion According to G.H. The concept of this book is just a character who, in a single moment in time in which a roach is being killed, she dives deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper within her psyche into the questioning of essentially living as a human being and all of the artifices that come with that, the moral artifice, the language artifice, the social artifice, all of these things, the aesthetic appearance that we hold, just everything. And she just keeps going down. And the thing that works for me about it is actually the failure within it, the ways that she's not a philosopher. She's not being analytic in a rigorous sense. She is just trying to capture a mode of thinking. And I felt like she captured that mode of thinking really, really, really well. It's hard to do a concept like this better because I think it needed to be unsatisfying in how it formulates itself. Because if you're going to be honest about what it's like to become fully manically obsessed with something, I do think you have to have that kind of messiness and stumbling, which she definitely maintains. And as far as an introduction to Clarice Lispector, it definitely introduced me to her courage as a writer. And then we have a book that you read this year that you would definitely reread. And at the very, very, very beginning of the year, I read Europe Central by William T. Vollmann. I've been reading William T. Vollmann for a while. I'm definitely going to reread this book because this one is about various figures in Russia and Germany and in the midst of the war during World War II. It goes back and forth between the two edges of that war through these characters who themselves are focused on parts of just living, just trying to make it in life, but then also some of the extremes of our character that can emerge in the midst of war. It's like a vignette style novel. It's just little scenes here and there broken up. It's a very uneven book. It's not a pristinely executed book. There are better books by William T. Vollmann. I say that I would want to reread this because I do think there's a kind of magic that he's capturing when you go through the book of feeling like the book is his own kind of processing of World War II. He's someone who's generally very interested in violence in history. He literally has multiple volumes on violence in history. More obviously, he just always is writing about the tension between individuals when they butt up, when two minds are at odds with one another, and the extremes that we go to when we feel like violence is impending, and our reaction to that, and how hard, how heavy that can be. When I read this earlier this year, it was actually my second time reading it. I feel like I'm going to read it at least one more time because I found that the second time I read this book, I felt like I noticed more of the flaws in William T. Vollmann's writing than I had noticed the first time. Because the first time I went through Europe Central, it just wooed me the whole way through. Then the second time, I'm seeing so many of his habits as a writer because I had read so many of his other books between. I wonder about the third time through, if I were to read it years and years later, what would I take from it? There's certain aspects of it that feel like someone who's at the end of an obsession, like the author himself, Vollmann, being at the end of an obsession with violence in history. I wonder if as I continue to follow his interest in that aspect, because I am interested in those extremes of people's character, what that changes about how I read what it is that he focuses on. So this is definitely one that I want to reread. And it's a book that I recommend as one of the early ways into a strange author like William T. Vollmann. But it is definitely imperfect, but that's also what's appealing about it in a lot of ways. A lot of imperfection is just that kind of humanness that I crave in literature. So it's nice to have some of that. And the thing that is imperfect is really just, he doesn't look away as quickly as you want him to. I guess it's nice also not to look away sometimes. That's why Europe Central is definitely a book that I would want to reread in a year or two. And then finally, we have the books you wish you had gotten to this year. And I'll just hold up a stack. I wish I had read 2666, Stalingrad, Life and Fate, and Solenoid. The reasons being, I hear about these books a lot from other booktubers. I know that Valentina is currently reading 2666, and she had also read Life and Fate before. And her reading of Life and Fate made me think it would be the perfect book to read after I had been reading so many different books about World War II or surrounding it. Life and Fate is the Russian soldier perspective of some of what was going on in that time. From what I understand, it also allows room for the softer humanness amidst all that. And then 2666 is just obviously a book that people bring up all of the time as being so amazing in its scope and also in some of the horrors that it puts you through. And so I'm curious what that means or what that entailed. And then The Active Mind read Solenoid this year, and he keeps talking about it as this incredible book. And so many other people who've read it just agree that there's something surreally pleasurable about it. I worry slightly that I've heard too much about it and that now my expectations are too high, but I really want to wait for the right time when I feel most like I can take it in as itself, as opposed to take it in with all the criteria of everyone else's thoughts laid over top. And once I can do that, I'm hopeful that I can get to Solenoid next year. That'll be the year 2025, Solenoid. And that brings me to what you will prioritize for 2025. Another bibliophile reads is having a read through of In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. And that's a great chance to finally read Marcel Proust. So I think I'll get to that at some point next year, probably. But I also want to talk about nonfiction a little bit more, especially the philosophy side of nonfiction. So that's what I hope to focus on for next year. And then hopefully I can also be a little bit more consistent with these videos. There's all kinds of reasons why I haven't been consistent lately, but I do have a lot that I would like to talk about for these videos. I keep taking notes of things that I want to talk about for these videos. I keep even recording little bits of videos and then just not feeling right about it. And so I want to get back into that state of feeling comfortable with this channel, of just posting things and feeling like I'm saying something of worth, and help all of you discover wonderful books that you can enjoy. Thanks for being here. I'll see you around real soon. I hope you had a really good 2024 reading year. Thanks for watching.